3 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law set a check on my hospital blanket and told me to choose. The room still smelled of antiseptic. I had a daughter asleep in the crook of each arm. Behind her stood my husband's girlfriend holding a diaper bag like she already owned the house. Vivian uncapped her black fountain pen, and the click was the loudest thing in the room. "Take 22 million and sign it," she said. "I only want the children." I looked at the divorce papers. I looked at my girls and I signed. Then I did the one thing none of them planned for. I picked up my daughters and I walked out the door. By the time their lawyer woke the next morning, the most expensive signature Vivian Harwell ever bought was already worth nothing. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. I'm Bianca, 33, an actuary, the woman this family liked to call just a calculator. This is the story of the night they paid me to vanish and the morning they learned what I actually do for a living. If you believe a quiet woman with the right numbers can undo people who think money makes them untouchable, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Here's what I do for a living. I price the things people would rather not think about. How long a body lasts. How much care costs at the end. What a promise is worth. 20 years after someone makes it. I'm an actuary. For 9 years, I sat in quiet rooms and built the math that tells insurance companies whether they can keep their word. It is not glamorous work. It does not photograph well, but it is honest, and it kept me grounded long before I ever needed grounding. My father sold insurance out of a storefront in a town with one stoplight. He died when I was 26, and the last useful thing he taught me was short. "The numbers don't lie, Bianca," he said. "People do. Learn the difference." So I did. I learned to stay calm when a column refused to balance. I learned that panic is just bad arithmetic in a hurry. Where my coworkers got loud in meetings, I stayed flat. "I don't get loud," I used to tell them. "I get accurate." The Hartwells found that hilarious. To them, I was the numbers girl who married up. A desk ornament Spencer brought home from a conference. They never once asked what I was good at. That was their first mistake, though it would take them a long time to feel it. Because the truth is, even before I married into that family, their numbers never sat right with me. Hartwell Provident published figures. Every year that I read the way you read a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I told myself it wasn't my company. I was wrong about which half of that sentence would matter. I met Spencer Hartwell at an industry conference in Hartford. He was charming in the way that costs nothing, and I mistook ease for warmth. He told me his family ran a long-term care insurer his late father had built. He did not tell me his mother ran him. We married in 18 months. I kept my job and my maiden name on my licenses out of habit more than foresight. The first time I walked into Hartwell House, the estate on the hill above town, I understood my place inside the first 10 minutes. Vivienne greeted me with a cheek that never quite touched mine, and a smile that failed me somewhere. The whole house smelled of her lavender, a scent so heavy it seemed to coat the walls. Walter, her husband, had died years before, and his portrait hung over the stairs like a man still presiding. Vivienne ruled in his name. The board did what she said. Spencer did what she said. I learned to be pleasant and forgettable at their dinners, which suited me fine. I am not a performer. I had my work, my marriage, and a future I thought I could see the edges of. For 3 years, I told myself the coldness was just old money being old money. I was the outsider who would slowly become inside. That is the story I sold myself. And I am good with numbers. But I have sold myself worse math than that. Then I got pregnant. And Vivian started smiling at my belly instead of through me. She would rest a hand there without asking. And call the twins the fifth generation. That was the first thing about her that scared me. And I did not yet know why. People think a betrayal blindsides you. Mine didn't. I read the signs early, because reading risks is my whole trade. Spencer started working late. Then later. Then with a softness in his voice on the phone that he never used on me. A man's tone is data too. Then the money moved. A transfer left our joint account for a sum that didn't match any bill we had, routed to an account I'd never seen. I asked him about it once, plainly. He said it was a company thing, and looked at his plate when he said it. I do not believe plates. So I did what I do. I hedged. I opened an account in my own name and moved a quiet cushion into it. I made copies of our financial records, the mortgage, the brokerage statements, the policies, and I kept them somewhere only I could reach. I packed a bag for the hospital, and a second bag I told no one about. The kind you keep by a door. I even started reading Hartwell Providence public filings again at night. The statutory statements every insurer has to file with the state, telling myself it was nervous habit. None of it felt like paranoia. It felt like underwriting. You don't hedge because you're sure the storm is coming. You hedge because you can't afford to be wrong if it does. What I couldn't do was close the joint account on my own. It needed both signatures, and the day I would have forced the issue was the day my water broke. That is the cruel arithmetic of timing. I saw the wave. I just couldn't get the door shut before it hit. I hedge for a living. I never thought I'd be hedging against my own husband. The twins came on a Tuesday, both of them, the long old-fashioned way. Two girls, 8 minutes apart, furious and perfect. I named them in the delivery room before anyone could weigh in. Posey and Wren. Small names, my names. Nothing that rhymed with 100 years of Hartwell men. Spencer was in a meeting when my labor started and stuck in traffic when it ended. He arrived after, smelling faintly of someone else's perfume, and held them like they were on loan. The person who actually held my hand through it was Ruth Vandermeer. Ruth was my old mentor, a retired actuary who'd spent a stretch of her career inside a state regulator's office before she taught me everything that mattered. She drove an hour to sit with me, and she did not leave. When the nurse asked for the names on the birth certificates, I gave my daughters my last name. To me, not Hartwell. It was a small, stubborn act of arithmetic, and I did it on instinct, the way you flinch before you understand why. Spencer didn't notice. Vivian wasn't there yet. For 3 days, it was just me and two warm weights, one in each arm, the only honest accounting I had ever done. I memorized them, the way one fussed and one watched, the way they both quieted when I hummed off key. I told myself the worst was behind me, that whatever was rotting in my marriage could be sorted later, with sleep and a lawyer and time. I am usually better at forecasting than that, because 3 days in, with the antiseptic still sharp in the air, and my body still wrecked and grateful, the smell of lavender walked into my room, and it wasn't alone. Vivian came in first, then Spencer, then a woman I'd never met, then a man in a gray suit carrying a folder, like a verdict. The woman was young and certain of herself, and she set a diaper bag on my chair, as if claiming territory. Bianca, Vivian said. This is Sloane. She said it the way you introduce a replacement. Sloane gave me a small, pitying smile. Spencer stared at the floor. The man in gray was Garrett Pruitt, the family's attorney, and he laid the folder on my tray table and opened it to a tab. Divorce papers, a settlement. And underneath, a relinquishment. Lines waiting for my signature to hand my daughters to their grandmother. Pruitt cleared his throat and called it a clean, generous, fully binding resolution. He said the word binding the way you describe a wall. Vivian sat on the edge of my bed without asking, uncapped her black fountain pen, and that click went straight through me. You were never family, dear, she said almost gently. You were a line item. Sloane actually nodded. Vivian slid the check across the blanket. $22 million for 2 signatures. Cheapest thing I'll buy all year. She tapped the relinquishment. Sign, and you're free, and rich, and gone. Don't, and my lawyers will spend a decade explaining to a judge why an actuary obsessed with money is unfit to raise Hartwell heirs. She let that sit. And in that pause, I understood why 2 infants were worth $22 million to her. Because it was never sentiment. Walter had tied the family trust to his own bloodline, control of the company, the chairmanship. The whole 100-year machine passed down through Hartwell heirs, and whoever guided them while they were small. Spencer was a weak vessel and the board knew it. But two healthy fifth generation Hartwells raised under her hand, and her name meant Vivian held the dynasty for another 20 years. 22 million to lock that down, and to get a sharp-eyed outsider out of the house for good, was not generosity. It was a bargain, and she knew it. The lavender was everywhere. Posey stirred against my arm. I looked at Pruitt's confident folder and felt something old and cold settle in me. The feeling I get when a number is pretending to be something it's not. I had spent 9 years finding the cracks in walls that men like Pruitt swore were solid. He had just handed me his wall and dared me to lean on it. So, I leaned. People always ask the same horrified question. How could you sign away your own children? I'll tell you, because the answer is the whole story. While Vivian talked, my mind did what it always does under pressure. It ran the numbers, 3 of them. First, a paper signed on a hospital bed is not a court order. A real surrender of parental rights in a state like ours generally has to be made under oath before a judge who certifies, on the record, that you understood what you were giving up. Pruitt's folder had no judge in it. It had a fountain pen and a threat. Second, nobody can actually buy a child. Custody isn't a deed. A court decides who raises a child by one standard, the best interest of that child, and a checkbook does not get a vote. A judge speaks the last word, not Vivian. Third and simplest, I was their mother. There was no order anywhere telling me I couldn't walk out of a hospital with my own newborns. None. So the real math was easy. If I refused, they'd keep me tangled for years and outspend me until I broke. If I signed, I'd walk out with $22 million, 2 daughters, and a piece of paper they believed was a cage, and I knew was confetti. I would take their money, take my girls, and dismantle them later on my terms with the one tool they were too arrogant to fear. So, I clicked her pen. I signed my married name, Bianca Hartwell, for the very last time. I wrote it slowly so they'd relax. Then I capped the pen, set it down, and reached for my daughters. We're done here, I said. And we were. Just not the way they thought. There was no screaming exit. Drama is loud, and loud is for people without a plan. I waited until visiting hours thinned and the floor went quiet. The hospital had already cleared me to go home. My body was sore and slow, but my arms worked and my daughters weighed almost nothing. I called Ruth. She was in the parking garage in 20 minutes because I'd asked her that morning to stay close. Another hedge I'd hated needing. I didn't drive. I couldn't, not 3 days out. And I wasn't foolish enough to try. I buckled 2 car seats into Ruth's sedan with hands that barely shook, and we drove away from the hospital, away from Merrill, to a furnished apartment 2 towns over in Bellhaven. I'd leased it a month earlier under my own name and told no one. The bag by the door was already there. On the ride while Posey slept and Wren blinked at the streetlights, I drafted a letter in my head. Word for clean word. A formal notice to be sent by registered mail at opening revoking the relinquishment I'd signed under duress, demanding they cease treating it as valid, quiet, documented, dated. If you've ever been the one everyone underestimated, the quiet one, the calculator, then you already know the secret they never learn in time. The calm isn't surrender. It's a countdown. I wasn't running away from the Hartwells that night. People run from things they fear. I was repositioning. The way you move capital before a market turns. Getting my daughters out of reach. So that when the floor dropped, it dropped on them and not on us. If you're rooting for 2 little girls and the mother nobody bothered to read, tell me in the comments and subscribe. Because morning is where this turns. By morning, the panic was all on their side. I learned the shape of it later from Spencer, who could never keep a secret when he was frightened. Pruitt got into the office early to file the relinquishment somewhere official, and discovered there was nowhere to file it. It wasn't a court order. It had never been before a judge. On its own, it was a piece of paper. A tired woman signed in. A hospital bed with her husband's mistress watching, which is close to the legal definition of duress, and which a competent judge could set aside with a sentence. Worse for them, by 9 that morning, my registered letter was already moving through the mail, revoking the whole thing in writing, dated and tracked. And there was no order anywhere that said I couldn't have my own children. I hadn't taken anyone's kids. I'd taken mine. Vivian called me at 10,000. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was missing its usual marble. "Bianca," she said, "let's be reasonable." It was the first time I'd ever heard her ask instead of tell. I kept my own voice level, the way I keep it when a client is melting down over a number they don't like. "I am being reasonable," I said. "I'm keeping my daughter's and your money. That's the most reasonable I've ever been." She started to threaten. I hung up. I sat on the floor of a strange apartment with 2 babies on a blanket and did the only celebration my nervous system would allow, which is to say, I made a list. $22 million had bought the Hartwells exactly nothing. No grandchildren, no silence, no closure. And it had bought me the one thing they had never given me: time. The obvious move was to lawyer up and fight for custody. So, that's the move I started with. Everyone expected it, including me. I found Marin Cole, a family attorney, with a reputation for not blinking, and I laid it all out across her conference table while a sitter watched the girls in the next room. Cole read the relinquishment, then read it again, then set it down like it had a smell. "This was never enforceable," she said. "Signed under pressure, no judge, your husband's girlfriend in the room." I could get this thrown out with my eyes closed. I felt the first clean breath in days. Then she leaned back. "But hear me. They have 100 years of money. If they decide to make custody a war, they can drag it 3 years and spend more on motions than most people make in a decade. They'll hire someone to paint you as cold, obsessive, unstable. They'll lose, probably. Probably isn't the word a mother wants about her kids. She wasn't scaring me. She was respecting me enough to be honest. I asked the question I already half knew. "So I win slow and bleed the whole time?" Cole nodded. "Or you find a way to make them want this over more than you do." I drove back to Belhaven, turning that over. Win slowly, in their arena on their fuel. I'm an actuary. I don't fight on the field that favors the house. I started doing different math. The girls had to be safe, yes, but safe didn't mean a courtroom. Safe meant the Hartwells couldn't afford a war in the first place. Cole said we could win. She also said it could take 3 years and every dollar I had. So I started asking a colder question instead. For a few weeks, I let myself enjoy the easy revenge, the affair. It was right there, almost gift-wrapped. Spencer and Sloane hadn't been careful. People in love with getting away with things rarely are. I had months of his distraction, a paper trail of charges to hotels and a jeweler, even a forwarded message thread a mutual acquaintance had sent me long before, sick of watching me get played. None of it was secret recordings or anything I'd be ashamed to show a judge. It was just the careless residue 2 selfish people leave behind. I could have blown it open. I could have sent it to the board, to Vivian's church friends, to the country club where she liked to be admired. I imagined the satisfaction, and it was real, and it was warm, and it lasted about a weekend in my head before I saw the flaw. Humiliating Spencer would only humiliate Spencer. Vivian would survive a scandal. She'd survived worse and buried it under lavender. Sloane would cry prettily and land on her feet. And none of it, not 1 ounce of it, touched the actual thing that threatened my daughters, which was never the affair. It was the money. The Hartwell money was what let them imagine they could buy my children in a hospital room. The affair was a knife. I didn't need to cut Spencer. I needed to cut the thing that made all three of them feel untouchable. I put the affair file in a drawer. Not because I'm a saint, because exposing it would feel good for a weekend, and I wanted something that lasted a lifetime. The question stopped being, how do I shame my husband? It became something sharper. What exactly holds these people up? Here is the pivot that changed everything, and I want you to watch it happen, because it's the whole point. My daughters were not safe because I might win a custody case. They were safe only as long as the Hartwells lacked the power to grind me down. Power for that family had exactly one source. It wasn't Vivian's will, or Pruitt's threats, or the portrait on the stairs. It was Hartwell Provident, the company, the river of money, everything else floated on. Take the river away, and Vivian was just a frightened old woman with a fountain pen. So, I stopped looking at them as my in-laws. I started looking at their company the way I look at any company that hires me, as a balance sheet, as a set of promises, measured against the money set aside to keep them. And the moment I put on that lens, the old itch came back. The one I'd had even before the wedding. Those public numbers that never sat right. I'd spent years dismissing it as not my problem, not my company, not my business. Now, it was very much my business. I pulled out my copies of their statutory filings, the ones I'd read at night when I was only nervous and not yet awake. I made a fresh pot of coffee. I put the girls down, and I started to read Hartwell Provident the way my father taught me to read. Everything, slowly, suspiciously, and from the bottom up. I stopped asking how to keep my daughters away from them. That was the wrong equation. I started asking what kept the Hartwells standing in the first place, because anything that holds a family that cruel upright is, by definition, the place to push. Let me explain what I saw in plain words because this is where they lost and never knew it. Hartwell Providence sold long-term care insurance. People pay premiums for decades so that when they're old and can't bathe or dress themselves, the company pays for their nursing care. To keep that promise, an insurer has to hold reserves, a mountain of money set aside today against the care it will owe tomorrow. The law requires it. Actuaries like me test it year after year to make sure the mountain is tall enough. The whole industry got this wrong a generation ago. People lived longer than anyone forecast. Fewer let their policies lapse. Care got expensive. Honest companies raised premiums or asked the state for relief, or, in some cases, quietly failed. I knew all that. So when I read Hartwell's reserves, against my own models, my stomach did the thing it does when a number is lying to me. Their reserves were too thin. Not a little thin. Thin like a man promising to feed 100 people from a single loaf and smiling while he says it. Their loss assumptions were rosy past the point of fantasy. Their lapse rates were numbers no real population produces. On paper, Hartwell Providence looked healthier and richer than almost any peer, and that was exactly the problem. Health like that isn't earned, it's manufactured. They were promising far more care than they had set aside the money to pay for, and reporting the gap as profit. That profit was the river. That river was Vivian's power. That power was the threat to my girls. The numbers weren't wrong by accident. I've made honest errors and they look different. Numbers don't get nervous. People do, and someone at Hartwell had been very nervous for a very long time. I needed proof I was right, and not just suspicious. And the proof was already in my own files. Among the financial records I'd copied, before I ever left, things that were legally mine, was a folder of printouts from Spencer's home office. Papers he'd brought home and left in our shared study. Most of it was noise. One page was not. It was an internal asset adequacy worksheet, the kind of cash flow test a company runs to check whether its reserves can actually cover its future claims. It had two columns. The left column was the reserve number the company had filed with the state. The right column was the reserve the company's own analysis said it actually needed. The gap between them was enormous. And in the margin, in Spencer's careful handwriting, a single instruction. Hold the line through the rate filing. Below that, 2 sets of initials. His and the company's appointed actuary. I sat with that page for a long time while the girl slept. 2 columns. 1. Truth they filed with the regulators, and 1 truth they buried in a drawer. And my husband had initialed both. It would have been easy to feel like I'd won right then. To mail that page to a newspaper and watch it burn. But I know how proof works, and a stolen page proves almost nothing on its own. A lawyer would call it out of context. An expert would say, I misread it. It wasn't a weapon. It was a lead. To make it real, I'd have to rebuild that gap myself. From the outside, using only the public filings any citizen can pull. The honest way. Until my number stood on its own without that page, the page told me where the body was buried. It didn't dig. That part was mine. Something shifted in me that week. And I want to be honest about what it was, because it stopped being only about my marriage. When I first started digging, my anger was personal. They hurt me. I wanted to hurt back. But you cannot stare at a reserve shortfall that size and keep it personal. Behind those thin reserves were people, real ones, thousands of policyholders, most of them old, many of them women, who had paid Hartwell Provident every month for 30 years on a single faith that the money would be there when their bodies failed them. Somewhere out there was a widow on a fixed income writing a Hartwell check she could barely afford, trusting that when she could no longer bathe herself, the care would be paid for. Vivian had gambled that woman's care to make the family look richer than it was, to buy a bigger house and a longer shadow. And when it suited her, a daughter-in-law's silence. That is the part I could not put back in the drawer. If you have ever been told to trust people who were quietly lying to you, who smiled while they did it, then you understand why this stopped being something I could let go. So my revenge grew up. It stopped being a knife aimed at one cheating man and became something colder and much larger, aimed at the lie itself. I wasn't going to expose an affair. I was going to expose a fraud. And I was going to do it through the exact machinery built to catch fraud, so that no amount of Hartwell money could call it a jealous woman's tantrum. This became about every signature those people had ever asked someone to trust. Stay with me and subscribe, because the reckoning is closer than they ever let themselves imagine. I needed someone who'd walked the path before me. So I went back to Ruth. We sat at her kitchen table with the girls in a playpen and my work spread between us, and I watched a retired regulator's eyes move down my pages. She was quiet for a long time. You built this clean, she finally said, but you're gonna want to do the next part exactly right, or they'll bury you in process. Then she taught me the map. An actuary with a credible, documented concern about an insurer's solvency can bring it to the state insurance department. If the concern holds up, the commissioner can open a financial examination, send in examiners to demand the company's working papers, the same papers that Page and my files came from. If the examination confirms the reserves are inadequate, the commissioner can petition a court to place the company under supervision. Conservation first, maybe, then rehabilitation, where the state takes the wheel to try to right the ship, and, if it can't be righted, liquidation. She watched me through the timelines and the thresholds, what would trigger which step, and roughly when. She did not write a single line of my analysis. She didn't need to. That part was already mine. What she handed me was better than a weapon. She handed me a blueprint of the building with the load-bearing wall marked in red. Understand something, Ruth said, tapping my shortfall figure. If you're right, you won't have to do anything to them. You'll just have to show the right people the truth. And the truth will do it. I looked at the number I'd rebuilt from the outside, the one that finally stood without that stolen page. It matched. Honest math and buried math, agreeing across a kitchen table. I knew then it was real. Then came the long part, the part nobody films, the weeks where revenge looks exactly like homework. I used some of the Hartwell money for the only thing it was good for, buy me the time and the tools to do this properly. I licensed the data I needed. I bought the industry tables. I rented a desk in a quiet office so I wasn't building a fraud case at a kitchen table with formula on my sleeve. And night after night, while Posey and Lonnie, Wren slept in the next room, I rebuilt Hartwell Providence' true reserve position from the ground up, using only what the public could see. Their filed statements, the standard actuarial guidelines every company in the country has to follow. The mortality and lapse studies the profession publishes. I didn't cut a corner. I couldn't, because I knew who would read it. I tested my assumptions, then tested them against harsher ones, then documented every single step the way you do when you expect a hostile expert to come at you with a flamethrower. The perfectionism that had made me lonely my whole life, the over-responsibility everyone teased me for, the inability to ever let a number be close enough, all of it stopped being a flaw. For the first time, it was exactly the right disease to have. When I finished, I had a reserve adequacy analysis that any regulator in the country could pick up and follow line by line. It said, in calm professional language, that Hartwell Provident was carrying a reserve shortfall in the hundreds of millions, and that its public solvency was, in plain English, a story. I built it so clean that even Hartwell's own appointed actuary, the man who'd initialed that page, wouldn't be able to stand up and call my work a guess because it wasn't. Spencer found me before I filed. I should have expected it. Cowards can smell a reckoning coming even when they can't name it. He showed up at the rented office one evening looking older and softer than the man I'd married, and he tried 3 different men on me in 20 minutes. First, the husband. He missed me, he said. He missed the girls. He'd made mistakes. I let that one die in the air. Then, the negotiator. There was more on the table, he said, if I just sign something cleaner and move on. Another number, bigger than the first. I almost laughed. Then, when neither worked, the last man showed up, the one Vivian had raised. You need to stop digging, Bianca, he said, quiet and ugly. Whatever you think you're doing, just stop for your own good. And there it was. He hadn't said one word about custody. Not one. A man fighting for his children leads with his children. Spencer led with stop digging. He wasn't afraid of losing the twins. He was afraid of what I'd find with a number and a license, because his own initials were sitting on the bottom of a page he prayed I'd never understood. I'm not digging. I told him, which was almost true. I'm finishing. He stared at me, and for a second, I saw real fear. And I felt nothing soft about it. He came to my office to buy my silence and left having confirmed, beyond any doubt, that my silence was worth buying. That told me 2 things. My number was right, and the man who could have stopped me, the one person inside who knew exactly how bad it was too frightened to do anything but beg. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Vivian came last, and she came differently than I expected, which is the only reason I'll grant her this one paragraph of being human. She didn't bring Pruitt. She came alone to a coffee shop in Bellhaven, and for a few minutes she wasn't a chairwoman at all. She was a widow. She told me about Walter, how he'd built the company from 2 desks and a phone, how he died with his name on the door, and his faith in her to keep it shining. And then, in a low voice, the confession underneath everything. The reserves had first gone thin years ago in a bad stretch. When the whole industry was drowning in its own bad math, she'd made a choice to paper over it just until things turned. They never turned. So she held the line year after year because the truth would not only sink the company, it would disgrace Walter's name forever. And she could not bear to let him die twice. For about a minute, I felt the pull of it. She was frightened. She was old. She had told herself a lie so long it had become a person she had to protect. And then she set her cup down and reminded me who she was. Those girls are Hartwell's, Bianca. She said, the marble sliding back into her voice. They belong with their name. You were a line item. Line items don't get a vote. There it was. She would burn 1,000 strangers' retirements to keep a lie standing, and she would take my daughters to feed it, and she would call that my legacy. The widow vanished. The chairwoman remained. Whatever sympathy I'd felt folded itself up and went quiet. For 1 second, I'd almost pitied her. Then she reminded me my daughters were inventory, so I filed. After everything, the loudest thing I ever did to the Hartwells made no sound at all. I packaged my analysis into a formal report and a written complaint to the state insurance department, the body that licenses and watches over every insurer doing business in Connecticut. I laid out the reserve shortfall, the methodology, the public sources, every step reproducible by any qualified examiner. I attached my credentials and my name because I wasn't hiding. People who hide get dismissed. Ruth reviewed the cover letter and changed exactly 2 words, then nodded. I didn't send it in anger. I sent it the way you send anything you've checked 100 times, with a strange flat calm. I drove it to the post office myself, and I also submitted it through the department's official channel. And I kept every receipt. No courtroom, no press conference, no screaming match across a marble foyer. Just a filing number, a date stamp, and a confirmation email. I sat in my car in the post office lot afterward and felt my hands finally stop. It was the quietest thing I had ever done, and somewhere down the line it was going to be the loudest. Because I knew what I'd handed them. Regulators have to take a credible, documented solvency concern seriously. It's the entire reason their office exists. They cannot read what I'd written and simply look away. The machine that exists to protect those policyholders, the widow with her fixed income check, was about to turn over and start to move. And it would move on its own weight now, not mine. I had pushed the load-bearing wall. All that was left was to step back and let the building remember it was built on a lie. The department moved faster than even Ruth predicted, the way regulators do when the math is undeniable and the policyholders are vulnerable. Within weeks, I heard the news the way the whole insurance town heard it. The state had opened a financial examination of Hartwell Provident. Examiners requested the company's working papers and reserve analysis, the internal documents that had to match what they'd filed, and of course, could not. You cannot hold a line in a drawer when the state asks to see both sides of the page. I pictured Pruitt reading the request and understanding, finally, that a wall he'd called binding had never been the strong one in the building. The rumors started immediately because solvency questions don't stay quiet in a small market. The company's value, all that, manufactured health began to shake. Spencer, I heard, stopped coming to the office. Vivian tried to call the exam routine a formality. Nothing to worry about, but you don't reassure people who aren't yet afraid. Sloane, watching the man she'd chosen go pale and silent, started asking questions about exactly how the Hartwell money was made. None of this needed me anymore. That was the beauty of doing it right. I had handed the truth to people whose job was to act on it, and now it acted without me, with a momentum no amount of lavender or legacy could slow. Vivian had spent a lifetime building a 100-year name. It took the state 9 business days from the opening of that exam to ask her company the single question it had spent a generation hiding from. And there is no fountain pen on earth, no matter how heavy or how black, that can write its way out of a reserve that was never there. Sloane was the first rat off the ship, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't taste a little sweet. She had walked into my hospital room with a diaper bag and a pitying smile, certain she was the upgrade. She had bet her whole future on the Hartwell name, the way you bet on a sure thing without ever checking what's underneath it. Now the sure thing was cracking down the middle, live in front of her, and Sloane was nothing if not a survivor. She hadn't fallen for Spencer. She'd fallen for a balance sheet, and the balance sheet was being seized. I heard she started spending less time at Hartwell House. Then she stopped answering Spencer's calls. Then she was simply gone, off to find a more solvent fortune to marry into, leaving him with a pending divorce, a panicked mother, and a name that had become a liability. There's a grim kind of justice in it. Spencer betrayed me for a woman who only wanted what my marriage had looked like from the outside. The instant it stopped looking like money, she vanished. And he learned the lesson I'd already paid full price for. The Hartwell fortune wasn't love, and it wasn't safety. It was a story, and stories end. Sloane had wanted to marry a fortune. She just never read the fine print on where that fortune came from, or how little of it was real. I didn't gloat. I had 2 daughters to feed and a case to see through. But I'll admit, when I heard she'd left him standing in the wreckage he'd helped build, I let myself smile for exactly as long as it took to warm a bottle. Vivian Drowning did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to command her way out. She summoned me. Not Pruitt. Not a settlement offer through lawyers, a summons to the company's annual policyholder meeting at the downtown headquarters, where she still imagined herself the woman who set the terms in every room. The message, relayed through a frightened Spencer, was vintage Vivian. Come here, clears throat reason, and we can make all of this go away before it gets out of hand. She still thought there was a number that would buy me, or a threat that would move me. She did not understand that I no longer had anything she could take or give. My daughters were with me. My money was my own. My case was already out of her hands and into the States. She was inviting me to a negotiation that had ended weeks ago in a post office parking lot when I stopped my own shaking hands. So I said yes, not because she had power over me, because I wanted to be in the room. There's a difference between revenge you do to someone and justice you simply stand beside while it happens. And I wanted to stand beside this. I wanted to watch the truth I'd rebuilt, line by honest line, walk into a room full of the very people Vivian had gambled and set the record straight in front of all of them. She thought she was calling me in to dictate the ending. She was setting the stage for one. I picked out something plain to wear, the way I always do. The clothes of a woman who works with numbers and never needs a costume. Then I arranged a sitter for the girls, and I drove downtown. The meeting was held in the big ground floor hall at Hartwell Providence headquarters, the kind of room built to make people feel safe about their money. Rows of folding chairs, a small stage, a banner with the company's 100-year seal, and the people, the actual people, filling those chairs. Mostly gray-haired, many of them couples who'd held these policies since before I was born. A few leaned on canes. One woman near the front clutched a folder of her own statements like a life raft. These were the names behind the reserves, the widows and retirees Vivian's lie had quietly endangered, and seeing them in the flesh made my resolve go very still and very cold. There was press, too, a couple of local reporters, because solvency rumors draw them like weather. Board members sat to the side, stiff, sensing something. And Vivian, at the front, in her best armor, a string of pearls and that crushing cloud of lavender that reached me from 20 feet away. On the podium beside her notes lay her black fountain pen. She had dressed the whole room to look like strength. Every chair and banner arranged to say, "Nothing is wrong here." She caught my eye as I took a seat near the back, and she gave me a small, certain smile. The smile of a woman who believes she still controls the math of the room. I held her gaze and felt absolutely calm. She thought she'd built a stage for a performance of confidence. She had. She just didn't know she'd built it for me, too. And that the only thing left to do now was let the right person walk to the front and read the room its actual numbers. Vivian began the way she'd begun 100 meetings, with a warm, unhurried voice of inherited authority. She thanked the loyal policyholders. She acknowledged certain rumors with a tolerant little smile and called them the noise of competitors and cynics. She promised a record year. She said the word strong 4 times, which is 3, more than a strong company ever needs. And then the side door opened and the temperature of the room changed before anyone even understood why. 2 people came in. One was a woman in a plain suit with a state lanyard and a leather folder. The other carried a banker's case of documents. The examiner. Vivian's sentence trailed off at the podium. The woman didn't shout or make a scene. Regulators rarely do. She introduced herself by title, the department's examiner, and stated in the flat language of process that following the financial examination of Hartwell Provident, the commissioner had petitioned the court and the company was being placed under the department's supervision effective immediately, with new business suspended, pending further proceedings. She said it the way I'd have said it, plainly, as a fact already true. A murmur ran through the gray-haired rows like wind through a field. The woman with the folder of statements pressed it harder to her chest. The board members went rigid. A reporter started writing fast. And Vivian stood frozen at her own podium. The record. Your speech still half in her mouth as the actual record arrived in a leather folder carried by a stranger. For one long beat, nobody moved. The 100-year seal hung on the banner above her head, gleaming, suddenly ironic. The strength she'd dressed the room in had no reserves underneath it. And now, at last, in front of everyone she'd lied to. The floor was giving way. Then Vivian broke. And I want you to notice who stayed calm and who came apart. Because that was the whole inversion I'd been building toward. She did not take it with grace. The marble cracked all at once. She gripped the podium, and her voice climbed into something I'd never heard from her. Shrill and furious, demanding to know who was behind this, calling it a conspiracy, a smear, the work of jealous people who wanted what the Hartwells had built. Her eyes found me at the back of the room, and she stopped pretending. You, she said, pointing across all those gray heads. This is her, my son's wife. A spiteful little. She snatched the fountain pen off the podium as if to sign something, to fight, to do anything. And her hand was shaking so badly, the nib only smeared a wet black streak across the page and refused to write. The pen that had clicked so confidently over my hospital blanket couldn't make a single mark. I stood because the room deserved to see who was answering, and I walked to the front, unhurried, the way you walk when you have already won and only have to deliver it. The press turned. The policyholders turned. I stopped a few feet from her, and I did not raise my voice. I never do. I told you, I said quietly, so the whole still room could hear. I don't get loud, I get accurate. Vivian's mouth worked. I went on even and clear. You said I was never family, just a line item. You were right. So I read the whole ledger, and the line that doesn't balance is yours. Someone in the rows gasped. 22 million for 2 signatures, I said. You called it the cheapest thing you'd buy all year. It turned out to be the most expensive, because the only thing it bought was a motivated actuary with time on her hands. But the people I actually cared about in that room were never the Hartwells. And I turned my back on Vivian to prove it. The woman in the front row, the one, clutching her statements, stood up on unsteady legs and asked the only question that mattered. The question I had carried with me for months. Is our care money safe? The whole room leaned in. Vivian had no answer. She'd spent 20 years making sure she'd never have to give an honest one. So I gave it. I told them the truth, plainly. The way my father taught me. The company had not set aside enough to keep all its promises. That was real. And they deserved to know it. But the supervision they'd just watched arrive was not the disaster. It was the rescue. The state stepping in precisely to protect them. I explained how the rehabilitation process works, to keep policies in force where it can, and how state guarantee associations exist as a backstop for exactly this. So that the widow on a fixed income does not simply lose the care she paid 30 years for. I stood between those frightened policyholders and the family that had gambled them. And for once in that company's 100 years, someone at the front of the room was on their side. The examiner beside me gave a small nod. My numbers and her findings had been telling the same story all along, and that, more than any speech, was the moment it was truly over. Not because I'd humiliated Vivian, though I had. Because the people she'd sold out finally had someone reading them the real figures out loud in daylight. The quiet calculator they'd thrown away was the only honest accounting that family had left. The wall came down quickly after that, the way they always do once the load-bearing piece is gone. Hartwell Provident went from supervision into formal rehabilitation, the state taking the wheel, its books pried fully open. The manufactured health evaporated overnight, and with it, the family's paper fortune. All of it tied to a company that had been quietly insolvent for years. The trust that Vivian had fed for decades with dividends pulled up from that hollow company now faced clawback into the estate. The receiver snorts, reaching back for money that should never have left. Hartwell House, pledged against the empire, slipped out of her hands. And the cruelest arithmetic of all, the one she'd sold her grandchildren to avoid, came true regardless. Walter's name, the legacy she'd lied for 20 years to protect, was now in every regional headline beside the word fraud. She had disgraced him to save him, and saved nothing. Spencer faced a professional reckoning of his own. An appointed actuary's initials on a knowingly false reserve filing are not the kind of thing his license or the authorities can overlook, and the matter was referred onward. Sloan was long gone. Pruitt's airtight wall had been the weakest in the building. They had been so certain that money made them untouchable that they never once accounted for the only risk that mattered, the quiet woman who knew how to read what the money was hiding. They did it to themselves. Every bit of it. I just declined to look away and handed the truth to the people whose job was to act and let the lie collapse under its own enormous manufactured weight. The custody question, the thing that started it all, ended almost as an afterthought, which is exactly what it deserved to be. When it reached a courtroom, a real one this time, a judge applied the only standard that ever counts: the best interest of two little girls. The hospital bed relinquishment never had a chance of holding. It had no judge, no oath, and a mistress in the room, which is about as close to textbook duress as it gets. Their father was mired in a fraud investigation and had never once fought for them. Their mother was stable, present, and the only adult in the story whose money was clean. The papers Vivian had bought for $22 million were worth precisely what I'd known they were worth in that hospital bed. Nothing. A judge spoke the last word, just as I'd counted on, and the word was that Posey and Renz stayed with me. My settlement held too, and people are always surprised by that until I walk them through it. The money never came from the insurer. It was paid out of the family's own trust, marital and personal assets the receiver chasing looted reserves had no claim on. And when the divorce was finalized, the court treated the financial split and the custody question as the separate things they always were. The duress had poisoned the one term no parent can sell anyway, my daughters. It did not poison a negotiated division of property that I chose, with open eyes, to affirm. A judge can sever the rotten term and enforce the rest, and that is what happened. I'd set aside a reserve against even the small risk, because I am who I am. I never had to touch it. And the strangest term came last. The court-appointed receiver, untangling the wreckage, needed actuaries who understood Hartwell Provident from the inside out. And there was an obvious problem with hiring the woman who had filed the complaint. The receiver's counsel raised it before I could. So, they did it the careful way. I was walled off from anything touching my own divorce or the custody case, retained as an outside consultant through the receiver's formal engagement process. My work reviewed by an independent actuary the court trusted. Cleared like that, I took it. I used part of that clean money to backstop the servicing operation, so the claims kept getting paid. So, the widow in the front row still got her care. I sign those checks now, honestly, at what used to be Walter's company, while Vivian watches from the outside with nothing. And I took back my own name. We are the Twomey girls now, all three of us. They were so sure the dangerous person in that hospital room was the one with the money and the lawyer and the heavy black pen, and they never once considered the quiet one in the bed. The one who already knew that numbers, like children, were never theirs to buy. That's how it ended, a fountain pen that wouldn't write, a ledger that wouldn't balance, two little girls asleep under the name that was always theirs.